does insulin resistance as a thing have a risk associated with it more so than ApoB as a thing? Insulin resistance has been found to be a significant predictor of cardiovascular events and plaque. There is still added value with HOMA-IR on top of ApoB. The physiology of insulin resistance has lots of layers. It's an onion.
Does insulin resistance raise risk of heart disease? How does it do that? Do we need insulin resistance in order to get heart disease? Can we still get heart disease if we are not insulin resistant at all? What sometimes people call metabolically healthy. Today we're addressing all of these questions and going through the evidence. Our guest is Dr. William Cromwell, board certified clinical lipidologist and fellow of the National Lipid Association with 3 decades of experience diagnosing and managing lipoprotein and metabolic disorders. Dr. Cromwell heads the Lipoprotein and Metabolic Disorders Institute. He is founder and chief medical officer at Precision Health Reports, and he is also a professor at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. He has published extensively on lipid physiology and metabolic disease. I absolutely love that I get to bring people with this level of expertise directly to your electronic device. That's the whole vision of the channel, and I learn immensely with these interviews as well. It's just a pleasure and a privilege. It's like my Disneyland. Just a quick note before we dive into it, that our conversation touches on some concepts that we've covered in previous content, things like ApoB and lipoproteins. So if this is completely new to you, check out some of our introductory content, and I'll link some of that below. But basically, ApoB is a measure of the number of lipoproteins in our blood that cause heart disease. So here's my conversation with Dr. Cromwell. Enjoy.
You have conditions where many things are going wrong at the same time. And as a result, it becomes really challenging to try to understand the contribution of one factor among many to risk. It is true that when you're insulin resistant, many things are happening. And there are people out there who are very invested in insulin resistance as a modifiable risk that carries with it a lot of heart attacks and strokes. That's true. Now, part of that risk is the fact that you have lots of atherogenic particles baked into the insulin resistant state. That is also true. So there have been efforts made to try to understand, does insulin resistance as a thing have a risk associated with it more so than ApoB as a thing? So this becomes a whole different challenge. There was a study done at UPenn looking at coronary artery calcium score as an indicator of plaque. And the question was, we'll use a measure of insulin resistance called HOMA-IR, which is taking your insulin level and your glucose and mathematically coming up with a term called HOMA-IR. It's very well validated. It's a good measure of insulin resistance, and ApoB. And so what they said was, okay, I've got these 2 different things. Let me adjust for age and gender, high blood pressure, diabetes. Let me adjust for medications, all the things you usually adjust for, right? I've done that. Now, let's just ask one question at a time. Does HOMA-IR significantly predict plaque? Yes. Okay. Does ApoB significantly predict plaque? Yes. All right, let me take another step. Does HOMA-IR predict plaque if I adjust for metabolic syndrome diagnosis? Yes. Does ApoB after I adjust for metabolic syndrome diagnosis? Yes. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Now, if I start with HOMA-IR and I add ApoB, does HOMA-IR still predict? Yes. If I start with ApoB and add HOMA-IR, does ApoB continue to predict? Yes. So they didn't knock each other out. They both were predicting even when they were adjusted for each other.
Just to clarify, when you say add, you mean adjust for it in a way, so take it out of the equation. Would that be a fair way to see it, to put it? To take one factor out of the equation because the other one is still an independent predictor?
So when you're doing this adjustment and you're adding extra information, the potential is that by adding more factors, the uniqueness of one variable is diluted over time. So you're going to dilute the impact of HOMA-IR potentially by adding more factors. If I add metabolic syndrome diagnosis, if I add ApoB, if I add these factors, I'm diluting potentially how much this one thing continues to predict. The more it's just a reflection of the company it keeps, the less it's going to predict, right? So if HOMA-IR is just a fancy way of saying, do I have metabolic syndrome? When I add metabolic syndrome, it disappears. If HOMA-IR is a fancy way of saying I have a lot of ApoB, I add ApoB and it disappears, right? So you have to kind of do this exercise to ask the question, is this a standalone or is it just part of the soup? And if it's part of the soup, I add the rest of the soup to it and it just disappears. And interestingly, HOMA-IR, while it was degraded, it still predicted even after adding ApoB. And ApoB, even though it was degraded, continued to predict after adding HOMA-IR. So both were important. Neither one was knocked out. And they're telling something that is not the same as the other. So now the next question, and this is called chi-square analysis, where you're going to ask the question, the strength of association. How strongly does one piece of information add to the other? The first question was, does it knock it out? The second question is, if I start with this and I add the other, is that significant? Is that a good add? If I have this information, did it advance the strength of the association? You start with HOMA-IR, you add ApoB, it significantly adds. You start with ApoB, you add HOMA-IR, it significantly adds. The magnitude is greater for the addition of ApoB, but there is still added value with HOMA-IR on top of ApoB. So this type of analysis tells us that they are both valuable. They do exist as part of a common soil, but both of them are important, and both of them are opportunities to identify risk as well as manage risk. I think that kind of analysis is important because I know there's a lot of debate out there with some people who believe only one matters and the other doesn't, on both sides of the equation. And that's informed by certain ways of handling data, and that's okay. If you handle data a certain way, you get a certain answer. But because they're connected and because there are these interrelationships, sometimes you have to do the harder stepwise analysis to really stress test the system and try to find out, is there really a one thing, the other is just along for the ride, or do they both actually have an important contribution and we don't want to dismiss either one?
So the take-home message, feel free to correct me, would be that even if my insulin resistance level is great, I'm insulin sensitive, I should still mind my ApoB. And if my ApoB is great in the healthy range, I shouldn't ignore my insulin resistance metrics.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I think that creates a safe harbor for a lot of people out there. And it also creates a good understanding for us as individuals of what can I do to potentially improve my risk.
And yeah, and I guess this goes back to this theme of, well, most chronic diseases of the Western world, but certainly cardiovascular disease being multifactorial. And this is something that I think people intuitively understand, that if my cholesterol is great, but I smoke, that's probably not a great choice. Or if my blood pressure is through the roof, even if the other risk factors are controlled, probably not ideal. But for reasons that I don't entirely understand, this question of the insulin resistance and the cholesterol, people have a harder time accepting that those might also be somewhat independent or complementary.
I think some of it is the way in which the conversation starts. So if we start the conversation with insulin resistance precedes diabetes. Insulin resistance is the physiology that leads to high glucose and risk of diabetes. Insulin resistance has been found to be a significant predictor of cardiovascular events and plaque. And we can go back in time. If we go back to 1995-96, the insulin resistance atherosclerosis study, IRIS, was one of the first ones to show that insulin resistance in and of itself was significantly associated with plaque formation. And then in a prospective longitudinal cohort, they showed that it was by itself significantly predictive of events. Okay, so that would set the table that that's a problem. And then you look around us, we're an increasingly sedentary, obese, insulin-resistant population. It's a very common problem. And because the types of particles you have in insulin resistance are these small LDL particles that carry less cholesterol, you typically do not have a high LDL cholesterol. You have a high triglyceride, but not a high LDL cholesterol. And if anything, it's a high triglyceride and a low HDL cholesterol. That's the common phenotype. So now we have this problem that affects lots and lots and lots of people that isn't a high cholesterol problem. It's not a high LDL cholesterol problem. So what I really need to do is become insulin sensitive, and maybe that would fix my problem. I understand that, and that's not a bad school of thought. But we also need to understand when we say, well, what's insulin resistance? Simply put, it's your cells not reacting properly to an insulin signal. Your body makes insulin. It works primarily in liver, muscle, and fat cells to do a job. And that job is to regulate glucose and lipoprotein metabolism. If the cells are doing their job properly with the insulin signal, your glucose is good, your lipoprotein metabolism is good, life is good. Now, let's say your cells are not paying attention or they don't respond properly. The first thing that happens is a lipoprotein abnormality before the glucose ever changes, before the insulin ever changes. The first thing that happens is the numbers of large VLDL particles go up, the number of small LDL particles go up, the number of large HDL particles go down, your overall size of VLDL is increasing, the overall size of LDL is decreasing, the overall size of HDL is decreasing. These are the earliest objective abnormalities that occur in the insulin resistant state. They predate increases in insulin. They predate changes in glucose. It's a deeply embedded part of the pathophysiology. That being said, we have to also appreciate that ApoB is going to be high in these people. It just is. And it becomes then a problem, which do I care about? And my answer is I care about both. I can't get away with a high ApoB over a long time without it causing increased risk for plaque events. And if I'm trying to get my ApoB down, insulin sensitivity is part of the way that I fix that problem. In many cases, if I lose weight, I decrease the amount of abdominal fat that I have, I improve my metrics of insulin sensitivity, my ApoB is going to drop. It may not go all the way down to a perfect level, but it will come down sharply. So I am going to improve both metrics by appropriate diet and exercise, and that's a good thing. And since there's such an integral part of the problem they pack together, it's artificial, in my opinion, to try to pick one or the other as the point of reference. You should fix the underlying physiology, and then you'll be pleased that both are moving in the right direction, and you can tune as you need for the individual once you get there.
Yeah. I think one point of confusion is that there's enormous individual variability. And so some people, just by losing weight, have great lipids. Others lose weight, but their lipids are still high or their ApoB is still high. And in others, they lose weight and their lipids increase depending on the particulars of the diet. So this is one thing that people are, yeah.
And one thing that would integrate your observation, which is all true, is production and clearance. To a lipidologist like myself, whatever you have a lot of, you either made too much, you didn't get rid of it, or both. So you can have an overproduction problem, you can have a clearance problem, you can have a mixed overproduction clearance defect. This is why the three observations you just made occur. In some people, insulin resistance is a mixed overproduction clearance defect. You decrease the production with weight loss, decreased central adiposity, but you may not improve clearance. So you've decreased your insulin resistance. You've improved ApoB, but not as much as you would like because you're still clearing poorly. In other people, you have individuals who are overproducing, and by virtue of their diet, their production rates have gone up even more. There are data, on the other hand, to say that in certain keto applications with a fat threshold, you may actually also decrease, suppress the number of LDL receptors that clear your particles. So you can actually make production worse, and you can make clearance worse, and you get the double whammy. So some of these people have crazy numbers, right? They go off to the moon somewhere. And you would be hard-pressed to explain that by simply making too many. And you would be hard-pressed to explain that by just clearing a little more slowly. It's a mixture, I believe, of both. And we still have a lot to learn about that. And then thirdly, you can have somebody who has, under the hood, a problem clearing to begin with, and you make them insulin resistant. Mm-hmm. And now against that backdrop, you're amplifying things in a uniquely different way. So diet, exercise, weight loss, glycemic control, improvement in insulin sensitivity typically improve ApoB to some magnitude, so long as you're not doing it in a way which is aberrant and causing LDL to go up. That you're going down doesn't mean you're going to get all the way home. So you may still need some additional steps because your clearance has not optimized, and it may never optimize with simply lifestyle change, but it certainly is not going to improve unless you do something.
Mm-hmm. One question people might ask with regards to this production and clearance balance is whether that matters for risk. In other words, if my ApoB is high because I'm producing too many or because I'm not clearing enough, is that different risk-wise?
So the short answer is, in the models that we have looked at, it doesn't matter why it's high, it matters how long it's high and what the magnitude of elevation is. So the understanding we have for atherogenic lipoproteins is its magnitude over time, which is the calculus for risk. And it is reduction over time that is the calculus for benefit. And whether or not you are primarily overproducing or whether you're not clearing has less to do with it than the magnitude and duration of the effect.
Mm-hmm. Most of the interventions and the genetic studies that I recall off the top of my head have to do with the clearance side. So all of these LDLR, hypomorphs, and statins, PCSK9 inhibitors, ezetimibe, all of these things act primarily at the clearance side, if I'm correct. What are some of the data pointing to the production side?
So most of our therapies have been focused on LDL receptors because that was where some of the initial work was done. The work by Brown and Goldstein was focusing on the LDL receptor. They got the Nobel Prize for that back in the 80s, right? So there was a lot of appreciation of genetically high cholesterol as an entity had one characteristic, FH, that was an LDL receptor axis disorder. And so that became their point of interest. And as part of their research, are there ways to make more LDL receptors? Yes. So now we had therapies that could directly mitigate some of the risk by making more of the thing that wasn't working well. That became a huge amount of work and swamped out everything else for a while, right? The production side of the house, you can look at agents like lamivudine and mifemersen. These are agents for homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. And what they do is they decrease the production of ApoB one way or another. So there are production sides of the house where we have agents that work. We have the clearance side of the house where agents work. And more effort has been put into clearance than production. Therefore, we have more data for clearance than production. And we're getting more opportunities now to decrease production. And that data is beginning to catch up. Mm-hmm. So if you look at some of the newer agents that are in the marketplace, PCSK9 is a protein that can be a target of therapy by the monoclonal antibodies, Repatha, Praluent. It can also be a target of therapy for inclisiran. And inclisiran is a medication that works through messenger RNA to decrease the production in the first place. So now we're getting agents that are tuned to turn things off rather than clear what we make. And LDL or lipoprotein late is another atherogenic lipoprotein that has new agents being developed that would decrease its production rather than just clearing it after it's made. Mm-hmm. So we are getting into this sphere now where we're thinking in new ways. And yes, if we decrease by either production or clearance and maintain it for a long time, there is benefit to that.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that was really interesting when you mentioned this interaction between insulin resistance and lipoproteins, that dysfunctions or changes in lipoprotein conformation and number is a feature of insulin resistance. That begs the question of which part of how is insulin resistance causing risk? In other words, first of all, is insulin resistance per se causing risk? Do we have enough evidence to say that? Or is it also a correlate of something else? And if so, do we know what about it? What is it about an insulin resistant individual that raises risk of heart disease?
So, put another way, the physiology of insulin resistance has lots of layers. It's an onion. And as you peel those layers, it becomes more complicated to try to apportion risk to unique parts of the insulin resistant syndrome. This is where it becomes very, very difficult for people to have confidence that this percent of the risk comes from this, and this percent comes from this, and this percent comes from this, because we have endothelial dysfunction, we have insulin signaling abnormalities, we have blood pressure abnormalities, we have lipoprotein abnormalities, we have glycemic abnormalities, we have the ways in which all of this interacts with physiology at the artery wall level. So by virtue of being able to unpack this in increasingly more complicated ways, we begin to lose the appreciation for exactly how much risk comes from exactly which part of this. Mm-hmm. So we learn on the one hand by division, but then we have to reassemble this in a way which tries to answer the question, and that means what for where my risk is coming from. That reassembly process is very, very difficult. And that's where people debate in hot terms. You know, what of all of this should I care the most about? Is it the endothelial dysfunction? Is it the inflammation? Is it the particle number? Is it the hypertension? Is it the glycemia? Yeah, all that's part of it, but I care more about this than that or this than that. And people are looking at small data sets handled in certain ways to inform them of what they're really, quote unquote, worried about. Mm-hmm. And I get that. And I'm not trying to say one group is right or wrong. I'm not trying to say that we've cracked the nut and that everybody agrees. What I would say is that it is not true that you have to be insulin resistant for increased numbers of particles to be problematic. And I am not saying that if you have increased numbers of particles, it doesn't matter whether you're insulin sensitive or resistant. The two are going to intersect with each other and amplify each other. You do not have to be a person with inflammation in order for ApoB to matter. But if you are a person with high ApoB and plaque, inflammation is going to accelerate issues markedly. Mm-hmm. And so this chicken and the egg phenomenon that we have is a great conversation to try to understand. But be careful. Mm-hmm. I think people get very invested in you must have inflammation or it doesn't matter. Not true. You must be insulin resistant or it doesn't matter. Not true. I have high ApoB and it doesn't matter if I have that in the setting of increased inflammation or not, or increased insulin resistance or not. That's also not true. Mm-hmm. It's going to be amplified. And so we do ourselves a disservice by taking this very elegant system and trying to simplify it into it's A or B, it's A and B. Mm-hmm. And because it's A and B, they're going to interact with each other very commonly. And we're going to intercept people who have an admixture of the elements, and they're all going to lend themselves to improvement if we can sustain insulin sensitivity for a long time, and if net, by virtue of diet, exercise, medication if needed, we maintain an appropriately low ApoB for a long time.
That was so well explained and so knowledgeable by Dr. Cromwell. I don't even think this one needs a recap per se, but real quick, cardiovascular disease is multifactorial, and ideally we want to manage all major risk factors: tobacco, blood pressure, glucose, ApoB, insulin resistance, inflammation, etc. How exactly we go about doing that and how far we can go, that's where personalization comes in. I know a lot of the topics we covered today are frequently asked questions, so we'll revisit this topic in the future and we'll go over more evidence if there's interest. Just to leave you with some actionables, here's a recent video on strategies to lower insulin resistance, and here's one on how to lower your ApoB. Not mutually exclusive. All right, let me know your questions below. Take care. I'll see you over there.